So we need to talk about the Insomniac leaks. A lot of interesting stuff coming out of that. So many people have made countless videos about it, though, so I'm not just going to regurgitate the news and talk about stuff that's already been talked about. But I am more interested in talking about people's reaction to the leak rather than the leak itself. The leak, of course, was very significant, from details about how much money Sony paid to license Wolverine, which was a lot of money, but also a lot of personal information, sensitive information about all the employees at Insomniac was also part of the leak. Unfortunately, a lot of so-called journalists use that as a reason to not cover it, saying, oh, well, there was personal information, so we can't discuss this at all, like Greg Miller and Tom Warren, just to name a few. It really demonstrates, maybe there is a lot of pro-Sony bias in video game journalism. It reminds me a lot of when the WikiLeaks emails came out about the DNC back in 2016, and so many people refused to talk about the contents of the email because it was a data breach, it was a leak of all this personal information, so we can't in good conscience talk about this. Like, obviously there's ulterior motives here, and it's not just a concern for ethics and all that, because yeah, I mean, there was other stuff aside from the personal information that is very notable and is worth discussing. And of course, there are a lot of Sony fanboys doing a shit ton of damage control on behalf of a big corporation that does not employ them, and they're trying to shut down any and all discussions related to this leak. But there was one thing in particular that was leaked that definitely sparked a lot of discussion about the future of not just Sony and PlayStation, but something that potentially has major implications for the future of the entire video game industry as a whole. And what I'm talking about is the sales for Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. According to Insomniac, according to the leaked documents, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart was actually a loss for Sony and Insomniac, having a return of negative 10%. And then, of course, this engulfed into a major console war because, a lot of the Sony fanboys would always dunk on the Xbox fanboys because it's like, what are you fighting for? You don't have any exclusives anymore. They're all on PC anyway, so you don't even have a platform. You don't have any reason to buy an Xbox. Even though Sony's starting to get there, though, they're starting to put games on PC themselves, not quite at the rate that Microsoft is doing, putting them day one on Game Pass and on PC. But it seems like the indication is that Sony is trying to play catch-up with Microsoft when it comes to their service, and they want to come out with something similar to Game Pass that would also be available on PC and mobile, just like Game Pass is. So therefore, you won't really have true exclusive games on PlayStation anymore if they're available on other platforms. But the idea that the sales for Ratchet & Clank proves that console exclusives and the console gaming medium is not viable anymore, as this one user on Twitter is trying to insinuate, it's complete nonsense. There's a small little company called Nintendo that might have a thing or two to say about that. Look at Mario Odyssey. Look at Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Look at Mario Kart. Look at Smash Brothers. Look at all their big blockbuster exclusive games, Pokemon. They've all been smashing successes, and they have sold. They definitely didn't go in the negative selling those games. That is for sure. And in the context of Ratchet & Clank for Sony, it doesn't mean that, consoles are starting to decline, because just the next day after these leaks came out, it was revealed that the PlayStation 5 sold 50 million units worldwide, just 1 week slower than the PS4 took to reach 50 million sales during its lifetime. So consoles aren't necessarily on the decline at all, and exclusives are still a very strong way to incentivize people to buy games on that platform, unless we're talking about the Epic Game Store, then, that's a different story, because ain't nobody want to buy games over there. I think this is not damage control by any stretch of the imagination. I am just as critical of Sony as anybody else could be. I just said early in the video how it's completely hypocritical that these so-called journalists were happy to talk about Rockstar, we're happy to talk about Capcom, we're happy to talk about Xbox leaks, but Sony, we're not going to talk about that. There's clearly something going on here in terms of bias and all that. I am fully acknowledging that. But in the context of the so-called failure of Ratchet & Clank, and how this is proof that Sony needs to put their games on PC in order to make money because there's just no money in consoles, let's just ignore the fact that the same exact studio, Insomniac, that made Spider-Man, made a shit ton of money off of that, no problem, on PS5. Rift Apart failed because it was released during a time. It was released in June 2021, less than 7 months after the release of the PlayStation 5. You know, the same PlayStation 5 that initially didn't sell all that well, not because there wasn't demand, but because there wasn't enough supply. For at least the first year and a half of that console's life cycle, you couldn't get one. It really wasn't until 2022 that the supply was finally catching up with demand and people were actually finally able to get a PS5 if they wanted one. That's the reason why Horizon 2 also got a PS4 release. That's the reason why Sackboy also got a PS4 release. The new God of War Ragnarok also on PS4. So many other games were co-released on last gen, but Rift Apart was not. It was only on PS5, of course, until it came out on PC as well. I believe if Rift Apart came out a year after it did, it definitely would have sold a lot better, because it would have been released at a time when the install base of the PS5 was more than double, maybe even triple, what it was at the time of its actual release in 2021. As much as it pains me to say this, Ratchet & Clank is also just not a very relevant game series. It's not much of a needle mover anymore. You had 3 games released during the past 10 years in the Ratchet & Clank series. One of them was Into the Nexus, which was a very short and very lackluster game. Then you had the remake of the first game, which was also a movie tie-in in 2016. That came out on PS4 and was the only Ratchet & Clank game on PS4. So the series definitely lost its relevance as they kind of winded it down and didn't release that many games for it. So you had an entire generation of gamers that were never really exposed to Ratchet & Clank. So when a new Ratchet & Clank game is revealed and is released, not as many people really care as they did in, you know, the early 2000s and early 2010s. So how exactly does this prove that exclusives and consoles are becoming less relevant? It's something Xbox fanboys are saying to just try to justify turning video games into Netflix and streaming and subscriptions and multi-platform releases, because it's the only viable way forward. No, it's just, it seems like a good way for these companies to make more money than they're already making, and they're just being greedy. Like, the other thing that was leaked about Sony wanting to raise games up to $100, instead of $70, go up to $100 by 2027. That's not Sony losing money and being desperate. That's them just wanting to get more and more money than they already have. That's what corporations do. That's the whole purpose of a corporation, especially a publicly traded corporation like Sony, which relies on investors, and the way to make investors happy is to have constant growth, because that gives them a bigger return on their investment. When that doesn't happen, the shareholders get angry and they sell their shares and they stop investing in the company, which Sony and other companies, including Microsoft, do not want. Look, as a PC gamer, I love the fact that all the Xbox games are on PC now. Not that there are too many of them that I really want to play. You know, like Xbox fans, it's funny, Xbox fans are the ones that are saying that Sony is in turmoil. Sony, like the PlayStation brand, is at its lowest and it just has no value anymore. Meanwhile, the flagship series of Xbox, Halo, is at the lowest point it's ever been. And there's really not much cooking when we're talking about first-party Xbox games. It hasn't been really that noteworthy, all the exclusive first-party games from Microsoft, since like 2012, 2013. It's been dead for years. But yeah, as a PC gamer that really doesn't have any interest in consoles, I love Sony and Microsoft putting games on PC. It only benefits me, but it's also disingenuous to suggest that they're putting games on PC out of desperation for survival rather than just a way to expand their market. Because if exclusives were no longer viable, then the Nintendo Switch would not be the second best-selling video game console of all time right now. Like, you can't tell me with a straight face that if they put all their games on PC as well as the Switch, that the Switch would have done as well as it did. Of course, the gimmick helped. The whole hybrid thing helped, but the games were another part of it too. They both went hand in hand. And it definitely does not feel like Nintendo has to play catch-up with Sony or Microsoft. They have to make their own version of Game Pass. They have to do this. They have to do that. They don't have to do shit. They're doing just great the way they are right now. So I think people are definitely reading into all this the wrong way and are jumping to conclusions that make no sense. The PlayStation fanboys and Xbox fanboys are constantly slinging shit at each other, making fun of each other, while the Nintendo fans are laughing on the sidelines, as well as the PC fans, but it seems like most PC fans are also Xbox fanboys by default, because Xbox is like the more pro PC platform, and Windows is a Microsoft platform, so when you're playing on a PC, you're actually also playing on Xbox. At least that's what the Xbox fanboys will try to say. But those guys are used to talking out of their ass and saying shit that makes no sense.